This is the Mangmi Air X. This is one of the most exciting budget Android handhelds that have come out this year. It is going to regularly retail for around $90. The early bird is $80, but I'm going to just say that you should look at this as a $90 device, as you'll generally be able to get that. Shipping may be included, so keep that factor when you look at this device. For me in particular, obviously, as I'm already showing you a PSP game, this largely favors PSP style games. And with the included chipset, we're able to drive a lot of games to 2x or 3x internal resolution. In this particular instance, God of War here, I'm running at a 2x internal resolution to be able to hit a consistent frame rate where it actually plays well. But for other PSP games, you can hit a 3x internal resolution bump, and that fills out this 5.5-inch 1080p 60Hz display. One thing to note about this 60Hz display is that when I originally got this, when looking at it in RetroArch, when you disable threaded presentation, what you're going to find is that it was kind of hovering just below 60Hz, which is not ideal. However, with the latest update, this is now locked to 60Hz, a little bit above, but that's specifically what we want to see. Now, I've already talked about the display, so let me briefly talk about the rest of the specs. The thing that's driving this is a Qualcomm Snapdragon 662 chipset. The beef of the CPU is going to be those quad A73 cores running at 2.1 GHz. Those are going to be the CPUs that we're really going to be engaging most of the time to run our emulation. On the GPU side, we have an Adreno 610 running at effectively 1 GHz. This is what I find to be very interesting for this budget handheld, because I've not really seen many Snapdragon 663 chipsets on any particular device. What I do find fascinating is that we can leverage all of the Adreno type of drivers, third-party drivers that can be used on other emulators. And while I have had no real success in terms of the best driver that I can find outside of the default ones on here, the default one on here, I have had some problems where games would crash. But when I did load a different driver, it ran, but there was just some obvious artifacting on the display. So not perfect. The ultimate point that I'm getting here is that you can just use the default driver now. You don't necessarily need to find a third-party driver. However, I'm confident that when the community takes a look at this, we will hone down and drill down to what the best type of third-party driver that we can get for this Adreno chipset and really maximize and push this device to new areas that haven't been already seen, especially if eventually, hopefully, that there are custom Android builds that find their way to the Mangmi Air X. Going right along, we have 4 GB of LPDDR4X RAM, 64 gigs of internal storage, and of course, this 5.5-inch 1080p 60Hz panel. For $90, what they have going on here, they're really min-maxing a lot of different specs, and it wouldn't be that far away like a year ago that we'd be paying over $100 for this easy. So hitting $90 on this device for the feel and build quality of what they have going on here, really well done. There are some rough edges, and we will talk about that in this review, but ultimately how I look at this device is one of the best PSP emulation devices out there, especially if you're looking to not spend a whole bunch of money. With that said, let's go over some of the emulation that is possible on this device and what you can expect out of the $90 cost for this device. Starting at the very top end, we'll be taking a look at PS2 emulation and GameCube emulation. For PS2 emulation first, I really want to stress here that we do not have enough horsepower to properly emulate many PS2 games. It's just outside of the wheelhouse of what's possible on this device at the current moment. Perhaps if we can overclock the CPUs, perhaps if we can get a better driver for the GPU, push the GPU harder, potentially with some custom firmware, this can potentially make it a better place. But as it stands right now, that's out of the cards. You should not expect most PS2 games to play well on this device. Most of them are not what I would consider to be playable. Likewise, for GameCube emulation, we're in the same type of area. There are a lot of more demanding GameCube games that really just don't pass the muster. Obviously, there are GameCube games that aren't as intensive to run, and those play just fine. One thing I do want to point out here is at least for Dolphin emulation, I had far better compatibility and success rate in terms of accuracy of emulation and how things were presented, especially how fluid it was using OpenGL as the backend as opposed to Vulkan. Now, with other third-party drivers that I have used, I was able to get it to not crash with a default driver that was already installed on the Mangmi Air X. Now, under that as well, we start getting into some of stuff that seems like it should be far easier to run, but isn't so easy. There is 3DS emulation that is actually quite possible on this device. I was a little bit genuinely surprised how well that ran. Now, again, we're in this kind of mixed bag territory of some games running really well. We still have some shader compilation stutter that happens. But outside of that shader compilation stutter, games can run perfectly fine. Now, there are certain 3DS games that are just seemingly too demanding for Citra emulation and this device in particular. And the result is it is going through, starting at a crawl and is completely unplayable. So again, we have a total mixed bag with PS2, GameCube, and 3DS. What is another hard emulation test to run on this device? Sega Saturn emulation. Sega Saturn emulation, especially the architecture of the Sega Saturn as it was, it is more complicated to run than the Dreamcast, which came out later and is more powerful than the device, which seems counterintuitive. But it's just the reality of the case that we're going to be not really leaning on the GPU so much to be driving all that stuff. We're going to be leaning very hard on the CPU. And as a result, those A73 cores just don't pass the test. You're going to have a lot of audio cracking and a lot of frame rate inconsistencies. Now, I always use the Beetle Saturn core because that is the more accurate Saturn emulator. You can use something like Yabasha and Shiro, but it's not really the best for me. I prefer to, if I'm going to be using emulation, I really would rather just use the most accurate emulator as possible. The downside to that is that with more accuracy comes a higher performance cost. And where we are right now, again, it's just a mixed bag. So those are really the stuff that really gets wishy-washy. Everything that's underneath that more or less runs just fine. And I think the highlight here, especially with the form factor of the device, is PSP emulation. And as I had said earlier on this, at least for God of War. God of War is typically a benchmark title that you're going to want to run for PSP emulation, especially on these limited devices. And what we can achieve is a 2x internal res and still hit very consistent frame rates, which is honestly excellent to see. And I'm not doing any frame skipping. I'm not doing any of that. So it's just running very well. And it's honestly what you're going to want to see. For other PSP games that aren't as demanding as these titles, you can go to 3x internal resolution, which is going to fill out that 1080p display real nice. Ultimately, that's where I'm kind of leaning on this device, is if you were looking at this through the lens of what type of emulation would you like to run on this, PSP just absolutely shines in here. And not for nothing, the analog sticks are superior to the analog sticks that were on the PSP. So even just playing on the device is, I would consider, better than a stock PSP. Now, the PS Vita, I think, is superior in terms of controls. Not so much the analog sticks, but the D-pad and buttons for sure are superior on the PS Vita, but these are still good. And we'll touch base on the D-pad review, build quality, and analog sticks in just a moment. I do want to just briefly talk about all the other emulation that is 100% possible, and you won't really have any particular issue running on this device. So you have like Super Nintendo emulation, Nintendo, Game Boy Advance. Game Boy Advance, because of the 60:9 display and a 3:2 aspect ratio on Game Boy Advance, it actually fills out quite nicely, and we don't have as much pillar boxing that is going on. So GB emulation is also really nice on this device. And then obviously we have Sega 32X, Sega Genesis, all that stuff works just fine. So from an emulation standpoint, that's the range of what you're going to find playable on this. I really want to hammer home the point that having a 1080p 5.5-inch 16:9 display with 60 hertz and an ergonomic, smallish handheld that feels nice to play on and is $90. Playing streaming games on this is really nice. I mean, I really enjoyed using it as a console companion, and between PSP emulation and streaming to this device, I think I might actually be leaning a bit more on streaming since I've tried it. I initially was really hooked on PSP emulation, but being able to stream xCloud on this and have it work so well, don't sleep on it. Going into the next part of this review, we're going to start reviewing the D-pad and the analog sticks. Up first, we're going to talk about the D-pad. For me, a D-pad is a very delicate balance. I am biased towards dome-based D-pads. I absolutely love dome-based D-pads. Membrane-based D-pads are harder to design and get right for most companies. Mangmi, having this, they didn't do a bad job, but it's not the best. I would overall give this a B ranking for the D-pad, and here's why. When we have membrane-based D-pads, one of the top things that I look for is feedback and fidelity of the D-pad itself. So when I'm pressing in any given direction, diagonals, left, right, snapping back and forth, that I can feel that membrane being crisp and snapping back so that I understand that I have actually depressed the button without having to exert any force. Now, with this particular D-pad, pressing hard on any particular aspect of it does happen. So there can be thumb fatigue, DPAD fatigue, where you can notice that if you are constantly pressing in any given diagonal, that there isn't a qualified feedback for you. So you kind of have to lean into it a bit more. Overall, at extended play times, you're going to start feeling that in your left thumb. For the face buttons themselves, I absolutely love these. I think they got them absolutely perfect. They're snappy and crunchy. They're excellent. I really love them. For the bumpers are fine. I don't really have any particular problem with them. I've had better bumper feedback quality. I think it's fine enough for what it is. And these triggers are kind of like Ioneo type of triggers, so they're flared out and a bit they're okay. They're not bad. I think overall the ergonomics of how it feels in the hand is generally good. From an ergonomic standpoint and how it feels, I would give it an A. But in terms of general input quality, D-pad focused, I would give it a B ranking overall. When we take a look at the analog sticks, these are pretty good. Overall, the type of sensitivity that you can push when you push in just a little bit, it responds immediately. There is no dead zone. It has great movement overall, nothing too crazy, and we see that it doesn't have an outrageous amount of cardinal snapping or magnetism to the cardinal axis. It will align itself, but it can eject itself out pretty easily. If you're the type of person that just really hates cardinal snapping, this will happen. You can freely get out of it, but you will see that it will align and snap to the cardinal axis pretty readily. So if that bothers you, this does it. For me, it doesn't bother me at all. And in fact, I like that particular type of magnetism that you can easily escape out of it and then kind of feel the divot back into that sweet spot. So I actually really like the analog sticks on this. I think they're excellent, and they are those like new type of analog sticks that are finding their way into a lot of newer retro handhelds, and we've thankfully long escaped those switch analog sticks. The last bit that I want to talk about here, and these are still some of the rough edges around here, when we talk about some of the things that are just kind of odd, you can control the fan speed on this device. It doesn't seem like it's terribly necessary most of the time. Leaving it off seems to be just fine. Going to like a medium speed is all I would really recommend. Going any higher, it has a high pitched whine to it, so I really wouldn't recommend going further than that. There are some rough edges in terms of how you just use the software. So like when you slide down the notification shade and try to swap the buttons, because by default they have a Nintendo layout. And if you wanted to go to an Xbox layout for any number of reasons, that you can't do that if it's not already in an application. You need to be in an application for it to kind of line up and kind of have that preset for that application. It's not a global preset, it's per application. So if you were to use Chrome to use xCloud, you can't actually change those buttons because it's not an app that it recognizes, which is unfortunate. Now, however, I have brought this up to Mangmi, and they are going to come out with a software update pretty soon that will allow you to globally change this pretty soon. So that's going to be covered and changed pretty soon as well. So by the time that you guys get this device, it's going to be even better than what I'm reviewing here now. So ultimately, can I recommend the Mangmi Air X? It's very easy to recommend it. They're doing a lot here that is min-maxing a lot of the specs and getting that cost under $100. And for the 5.5-inch 1080p 60Hz screen, the Snapdragon chipset, 4 gigabytes of LPDDR4X RAM, Android 14, the form factor of the device, how the buttons feel, the analog sticks, everything is like you can feel that they're really, really being precise with trying to min-max all the components and still getting it on $100. So they deserve credit for being able to achieve that goal. And I think that what they set out to do, they have succeeded. So great job to Mangmi for making the Air X and succeeding there, because I think it's a overall great budget Android handheld. It does have some things that feel borrowed from a lot of devices, like especially holding the device, how the ergonomics feel, the flared out analog sticks. They are borrowing heavily from Ioneo devices, other devices. So it does feel like almost like a combination of other stuff. So it's not bad. I'm just saying that you can feel its presence, its fingerprint of other devices that have made its way into this package. Obviously, if you were looking for PSP emulation or if you're looking for game streaming, that's where I find it to have the most value. Thank you very much to my YouTube channel members as well as my Patreon members. Your support really means the world to me, guys. I hope this video was informative. As always, guys, thank you for your time, and thanks for watching.